Welcome to episode 44, if I'm counting right, of Call to the Bar International Law Over Drinks. I'm your host, Douglas Guilfoyle, Professor of International Law and Security at UNSW Canberra. And today I'm joined by Tamsin Phillipa Paige, Associate Professor of Law at Deakin Law School, and Ntina Tzouvala, Associate Professor at UNSW Sydney Law and Justice, to discuss when is a war on drugs actually a war? Hang on to your hat as we discuss, once again, the problems of metaphorical reasoning in law. The reason this frankly fairly odd question even arises is the Trump administration's decision to engage in creative legal characterization of various drug cartels in order to invoke powers under domestic statutes, or at least that's the best sense I can make of what's going on. For example, it is claimed that certain cartels, such as TDA, I won't attempt to pronounce the Spanish, are conducting irregular warfare against the United States and constitute the de facto government of areas of Venezuela, and have done so in order to invoke the Enemy Aliens Act of 1798 to detain and deport somewhere between 100 and 200 individuals to Venezuela without any judicial process. The Trump administration has now also declared TDA and MS-13 to be domestic terrorist organizations, as they are apparently akin to entities engaged in insurgency and asymmetrical warfare. But could this spill over into an actual invasion of a country like Mexico? And what would be the legal basis for such a move? Must we? Really, must we? Attempt to slay the zombie unable or unwilling doctrine once again. For the blissfully and forgivably ignorant, this is the doctrine that supposedly justifies actions against a state which is unable or unwilling to restrain non-state armed groups engaged in cross-border attacks and operating from its territory. But before we dive into this mess, I once again remind everyone that in these informal conversations, we are, as always, speaking off the cuff and without benefit of footnotes, and nothing we say should be taken to have been thoroughly peer-reviewed. First off, though, team, our traditional question, and noting the hour at 3:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, what's your drink? Dina?
Yeah, I think it being 3:30, it's time for my mid-afternoon coffee. So I am having a very simple coffee, and I'm also keeping hydrated with some water. And the coffees, I am the opposite of people with sort of like sophisticated coffee taste. I'm literally having instant coffee with milk. Yes, I know I said it.
Get behind me, Satan.
I know that's an extremely controversial thing to be doing at the east coast of Australia, but sometimes I just...
Greek on the east coast of Australia drinking instant coffee.
Look, at least you're not doing it in Melbourne.
That's
well,
right.
you'd be stoned.
That's right.
Yeah.
I think, they would have deported me, but sometimes I feel you just need, or maybe I just need something that is like warm and wet and caffeinated. I don't need it to be an interesting experience.
Yeah, but warm, wet and caffeinated, I reserve for like very weak English style tea. In any event, Tamsin.
So I have tea. I have a special finest tippy golden flowery orange pico Assam. So that's the technical term for the acronym. I usually refer to it as something far too good for ordinary people instead. But I have a pot of Assam that is something far too good for ordinary people, but broken out for the special people of Called to the Bar.
Oh, how lovely. I love a good Assam. People who long-term listeners may remember the Korean herbal tea sampler box from season 1. I've found it again and I'm having some hydrangea tea. My palate is not such that I can give really good tasting notes. It tastes perfectly pleasant, and I'd forgotten one could make tea out of hydrangea. Now, look, before we get stuck into questions of substance, I should note that one, but by no means the only, version of the argument we'll discuss today has been put by the scholar Pete Pedroso on the Articles of War blog. So full disclosure, I've collaborated with Pete in the past and recently asked him to write a book chapter on the law of naval neutrality, which I think is excellent. But a feature of academic life is that we don't always agree with our colleagues and that frank and forthright disagreement is part of the game. We always try to play the ball and not the player. In any event, to recap what we said at the top, in January 2025, the Trump administration designated a number of Mexican drug cartels as terrorist organizations under US law. Subsequently, some US lawyers and commentators have argued that this designation coupled with the severity of the opioid crisis in the US, could justify the use of force in self-defense by the USA. Could one of you explain to me and everyone listening the thrust of this argument? How do you put these pieces together? Ntina, I'm going to pick on you.
Sure. And I think the piece that you mentioned by Professor Pedroso is a good sort of foil to understand this argument. So as you signaled earlier, basically this whole argument hinges on a number of points. The first is that the harm inflicted on the United States by the opioid crisis essentially is an armed attack, or some aspect of that harm is an armed attack. So you need to believe that. And then, if you believe that, and that is asking a lot from the believers, you have to believe that there is a standard in international law that is the unwilling or unable standard that says if a state, in this instance the United States, is experiencing an armed attack per the meaning of Article 51, this armed attack emanates from the territory of another state, let's say Mexico, but it does not emanate from an actor that is controlled by the state, let's say the Mexican government or an armed group that is under the effective control of the Mexican state. It nevertheless can use defensive force in the territory of Mexico, assuming if Mexico, without Mexico's consent, which is a given here, if it can show that Mexico is unwilling or unable to put an end to these armed attacks. And I'm saying that, this is an even trickier process than usually, not only because the legal status of the unwilling or unable doctrine is at best contested and at worst non-existent, but also because in this instance it is extremely implausible, and indeed I don't know any other state beyond the United States to say that the very real harms of the opioid crisis have anything to do with an armed attack per the meaning of Article 51, right? We know, for example, from the drafting of the charter, there was a really big disagreement between some non-Western states that wanted non-kinetic forms of force to be prohibited because they were thinking, for example, about things like sanctions or economic coercion that can actually bring about, suffering and misery and compulsion that is sometimes greater to that of kinetic force. But we also know that Western states very unanimously oppose to that, right? And it is true that the opioid crisis has caused the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives in the United States. That doesn't make it an armed attack, right? It makes it an extremely pressing social problem. And an extremely pressing social problem that is, we can get maybe back to that, like the making of US policy for decades. Mexican cartels can play a role, but also deregulation of the medical profession and the pharmaceutical industry plays potentially a bigger role. And therefore, I think what we can see here is not a plausible legal argument, but it is an effort that we have been seeing for a very long time. But I think this is a qualitative and quantitative escalation to totally empty out armed attack from any recognizable meaning, right? I think this is not new. It's part of a trajectory, but I think we have not seen, as far as I know, anything as orthogonal with the orthodox meaning of armed attack before. And that's before we go to unwilling or unable.
Right. So let me just, before throwing to Tamsin, let me just row back a little bit, possibly to quote the thick of it, all the way to the boathouse. So for those who are new to this discussion or want a refresher, obviously we're starting here with the law of the UN Charter. Article 2.4 says that the territorial integrity and political independence of states must be respected. Exceptions to that, when you could move troops across the border into a foreign state, include consent, which Ntina mentioned. So if you've been invited to assist, or self-defense under Article 51, as Ntina mentioned, which is preconditioned on an armed attack, which is normally understood to be kinetic and involve military force. Or maybe you have to argue somehow there's another exception not found in the Charter. So that's why we're throwing these particular terms around.
Yeah.
We're looking at the exceptions to the territorial integrity of states that would allow you to deploy military force against a foreign state. Tamsin.
So on the armed attack note, even if we accept the opioid crisis as an armed attack, there's a bigger problem here in that there would need to be a single transportation of opioids over the border reaching the threshold of armed attack, not the collective over years individual actions. So they wouldn't all amalgamate into one unit. They would be operate independently, and they'd need to reach a scale and effects threshold as per Nicaragua and oil platforms to reach the threshold of armed attack rather than border skirmish or something like that. So even if we accept the possibility that drug trafficking can be an armed attack, which I mean, I think it's a very good joke. But like, it's ridiculous. But even then, you'd need to have instances that individually reach that threshold. You couldn't just say that all of them cumulatively constitute a single continuing act, therefore reaching a threshold of armed attack to even bring self-defense into play at all.
Right. So Tamsin's point goes to the idea that for something to be an armed attack under the ICJ case law, it has to reach a certain scale and effects, and that would usually be a single event. So I mean that brings us to a question of characterization, but also another controversial doctrine, right? The accumulation of events theory, which is largely only supported, as I recall, by or mostly was, I think, proposed by Yoram Dinstein and other Israeli scholars, so very much minority position. I guess we should also flag, though, that the UN Charter prohibits the use of force in international relations under Article 2.4, and then draws this higher threshold for armed attack at which you get a right to respond in self-defense. But notably, again, in terms of the scholarship coming out of the US government doctrine is there is no difference between a use of force and an armed attack, the so-called no gap thesis. So any use of force can give rise to a right of self-defense. Now, there are a lot of problems with that position, just linguistically, but I think we're sort of perhaps seeing the layering of different bits of US thought here. Ntina?
Yes, and I want to say especially about the no difference argument that even very close allies of the United States and very close allies in the war on terror, I'm thinking like the UK here, have been very clear that they do think there is a gap, right? So the example here would be when Russia murdered, who did they murder in London? Sorry, I'm suddenly drawing a blank.
I can't remember who it was, but I do know the
Lukashenko?
The person
incident.
that they
Sorry,
poisoned.
Douglas?
Lukashenko, who was
Yes,
poisoned with polonium?
that's the one. It was really interesting that if you read, for example, the language of UK authorities, they speak very clearly about, for example, that this is a violation of their territorial integrity. This is even potentially an unlawful use of force, but not that this is an armed attack and therefore
Right.
giving.
So as a sidebar, I mispronounced his name. It was Alexander Litvinenko, who was poisoned in 2006 with polonium-210.
Yes, I think I'm thinking of something more recent. Anyhow, maybe.
Yeah, I think there was a more recent one as
Oh,
well.
you think of the Novichok nerve
Maybe.
agent attack in Coventry?
maybe cut this because yes. But anyhow, the point stands that even very close allies of the United States and close allies in the war on terror who have otherwise accepted other aspects of the US argumentation do insist on the difference, that there is a difference of intensity between a use
which is consistent with ICJ jurisprudence. The ICJ has consistently said that not all uses of force reach the scale and effects threshold for to be an armed attack, triggering the allowance of self-defense under Article 51. So,
right. So, I mean, just to tie this point up and again, kind of bring it back to that case study. So, Sergei and Yulia Skripal, who were defectors or who had taken political asylum in the UK in Salisbury, I had the wrong cathedral town, were poisoned in 2018 with the nerve agent Novichok by Russian agents. And that is obviously a use of force on UK territory by a foreign state insofar as it caused injury to real people. But that use of force was not treated by the UK as giving authorization for a drone strike, for example, on the Kremlin in self-defense.
Exactly. And if you see, the language is so careful in saying that we think this is an unlawful use of force and an unlawful violation of our territorial integrity, but at no point do they ever say armed attack.
Right.
And I think that's a good indication of like what is, a very close ally's view on the matter.
And again, to make the international law point, self-defense is not your only means of response to an unlawful act, right?
Yeah.
And it's not even that you have to go to the ICJ and then people can talk about how ICJ rulings aren't truly enforceable, blah, blah, blah. You can express your displeasure through retortion. You can expel diplomats or you can impose countermeasures, right? So there are other means of response, and the whole point of the architecture around the use of force in the UN Charter is that at the end of the Second World War, having had the experience of 2 world wars, it was thought maybe early recourse to force is a bad idea, and we should actually have a legal standard that encourages restraint. Tamsin.
I was also just going to say that a drone strike on the Kremlin in that instance wouldn't be a self-defense use of force. It would be a retaliation strike because you're not preventing an armed attack at that point in time. But I'll touch on that more later.
Yeah. No, and thank you. You don't have a right of retaliation. For obviously, force used in self-defense must be to repel an ongoing armed attack. All right, but look, let's bring this back to the doctrinal sort of point that we foreshadowed, the so-called unable or unwilling doctrine. So the basic questions are, and to some extent we've already covered this, where did this unwilling or unable doctrine come from, and has it been embraced by any other states besides the USA? And has the USA actually expressly endorsed it that often?
Yes, the answer is yes, occasionally. So where does it come from? It's interesting, right? Its defenders would tell you it has an extremely long historical pedigree. And indeed, many of the instances cited by defenders, including by the piece that you mentioned earlier by Professor Pedroso, predate 1945, right? They are instances, very often instances in which the US used force against Mexico in the past, in which the doctrine was supposedly invoked. And that may be true. What is also true is that very often in those cases, the state, even before 1945, the state targeted actually questioned the legality of these uses of force, even back in the day, right? So that's the long historical trajectory. I would say in the more short version, the doctrine seems to have gained popularity amongst both aspects of US practitioners and US academia the last 10 to 15 years. The US has, at least in certain instances, explicitly says that it relied on it. So on some of the letters that the US sent to the US Security Council, justifying, for example, some of its strikes against ISIS in Syria during the Syrian civil war. They argued, more or less convincingly, that they did so because the then Assad government was unwilling or unable to battle ISIS. So it is explicitly mentioned in some of these letters, right? It is also, I would say, especially more so than it is popular amongst US practitioners, it's really popular amongst US academics. And I would say especially US academics who are also circulating between academia and practice. So Professor Ashley Dix has been very central in the, I would say, revival of these doctrines, of this doctrine the past 10 to 15 years. The US is not alone, even though it definitely has been central. The doctrine does have support among some other Western states, especially states, again, that were close to the United States during the War on Terror. So Australia has flirted with it in less clarity than the US has, but it has nevertheless flirted with it. The UK appears to have endorsed it quite unequivocally. And also, actually, very few, but a real number of non-Western states. So Turkey is the most typical example. Turkey has used the doctrine to justify uses of force against Kurdish groups in Iraq's territory that they consider to be leading armed attacks against Turkish territory. And Pakistan weirdly has a very complicated relationship with the doctrine. And Pakistan is interesting because it was such a central terrain for the war on terror, right? On the one hand, Pakistan has at times publicly protested the invocation of the doctrine by the United States to justify targeted killings in Pakistan's territory, but at the same time, it appears to flirt with the doctrine when it uses force in Afghanistan's territory against non-state actors. Long story short, though, these are not many states. Even if we account for the fact that, there is some geographic distribution, this is still a very small minority of states. And a lot of states, especially Latin American states, and not coincidentally, especially Mexico, have been unequivocal in their condemnation, right? The G77 has been unequivocal in their condemnation of the test and in reaffirming that they think that something like the effective control test that the ICJ put in place in the Nicaragua case is still, they still consider that to be the most appropriate test. For those listeners whose Nicaragua knowledge is not fresh, basically the ICJ said a pretty high threshold. It said in the attribution there was not in the context of use of force, it was in the context of IHL, but it nevertheless said, and it's been applied to use at Bellum as well, that in such an instance, the state, the territorial state would need to be in effective control of the non-state actor, and effective control was interpreted both in the Nicaragua case and in subsequent cases to be basically an extremely high threshold, right? In the case of Nicaragua, the US was funding the Contras. It was providing training. It was providing ideological guidance. It was even providing general operational guidance, but not individual guidance and control over each and every military decision. And the ICJ found that the US was not in effective control of the Contras. right?
Right.
So it seems that a big part of the world, definitely the G77, is still in agreement with the effective control being the operative test for self-defense when it comes to non-state actors. On the other end of the spectrum, there is the US, the UK, Turkey, maybe Pakistan that say unwilling or unable. And there is also somewhere in the middle places like Germany that say that seem to say something in between. They say, for example, oh, if the state has totally lost control of a part of its territory, in that, and the non-state actor is operating as a quasi state, only in such extremely high cases would there be self-defense against the non-state actor in the territorial state. So
Just to draw a few
yes,
threads together
yes.
there and kind of, one, we're talking about whether there's some kind of customary international law rule that provides a further exception not found in the Charter. For there to be a customary international law rule, there needs to be a very high degree of support and very uniform practice. And when you've got what appears, out of a international community of 195, 197 states, if you've got the group of 77 against something, the odds of it becoming custom are fairly low. And when you've only got half a dozen or so states who are expressly in favor, that's a problem as well. More than that, though, Dina has underlined the point that, in the case law of the International Court of Justice, the way you can attribute the conduct of a non-state actor to a state is this very high threshold of effective control, at which point the actions of the ostensible non-state actor are treated as state actions. Now, that is that standard of attribution is an awfully long way from not doing enough to stop them, right? So there's a big gap there in the doctrine, and then there's a very limited pool of support for this idea in the international community. So that leads me to the question of, what's at stake in this doctrine, as in what are the implications if it gains broader acceptance? And so in particular, does this doctrine point to a genuine gap in the law of self-defense, or is it just sparkling appellation contrôlée aggression? Tamsin, I know you've got definite views on this, so I'm going to throw to you first.
Yeah, so it's important to note here that since, I can't remember the exact Security Council resolution, but since the September 11 Twin Tower attacks, we have acknowledgement from Security Council jurisprudence that self-defense against non-state actors is permissible. Hasn't translated into, as far as I'm aware, into any ICJ jurisprudence, but the Security Council has effectively, through Article 39 and Article 25, said that that's within the scope. However, this then brings us to the requirements of self-defense. And the requirements of self-defense needs to be an armed attack, which means it needs to have scale and effects thresholds. It needs to be imminent, and the response needs to be proportional. And this is where the entire unwilling and unable doctrine as a method of self-defense falls over. Because if there were drug cartels engaging in armed attacks, there was already scope under Article 51 in combination with previous Security Council decisions for isolated operations to prevent that armed attack. That is not an ongoing existential threat response available to self-defense. You can't just say, well, they might be planning more attacks, so therefore we just need to destroy them. You can't do that. That's not proportional. It's not imminent. And therefore you also haven't met the gravity threshold under scale and effects. So using unwilling and unable is literally, it's a doctrine to bypass the prohibition on the use of force and the prohibition on aggression and the crime of aggression. It's literally just an attempt to couch aggression under terms of self-defense to bypass the prohibitions, because where there is any sort of non-state actor actually engaging in an armed attack, there is permission already under international law to take steps to prevent that. You don't need this separate doctrine. This doctrine is generally employed to engage in proactive, preemptive strikes to a perceived but not yet actual threat. And that, my friends, is aggression, not self-defense.
And just to add a footnote, it was UN Security Council resolutions 1368 and 1373 after the events of September 11, 2001, which acknowledged not at all, that the United States had a right of self-defense insofar as they framed it as having been subject to an armed attack. But saying that a non-state actor is capable of delivering an armed attack doesn't actually tell us what you can do as a consequence of that, as Tamsin's pointed out.
And
Ntina?
I would also, can I just also add,
Sure,
before we move on, that armed attack and all sorts, and use ad bellum questions and IHL questions, as we pointed out in previous episodes, is a question of fact. And so therefore, you need to have evidence that there is an armed attack, either afoot, in progress, what have you, that you are preventing. It's a question of fact. It's not a vibes question. It's not, the argument from the castle.
Yeah, also something that sort of occurred to me along these lines is, and I don't really know the breakdown, so I've done no research, I've got no factual basis for this, but when I hear the term opioid crisis in America, I largely think of the over-prescription and over-availability of pharmaceutical, like company-provided opioids, not drugs flooding across the border from Mexico. I don't mean to belittle the crisis, and I don't mean to say that non-legally regulated drugs aren't a part of it, but surely that also makes pharmaceutical companies that have engaged in malpractice some sort of domestic terrorist organization.
Yeah, as is. So I think the two basically became linked, right? What happened is the overprescription of legal drugs that shouldn't have been so easy to prescribe got people hooked up, and then these people start taking fentanyl. But yeah, you're right. Everyone, and not just pharmaceutical companies, every single doctor and medical representative should also be designated, and we should start striking everyone. Which actually brings me to this point, right, which adds to what Tamsin has
Sorry,
said.
you heard it here first, Call to the Bar listeners. Tzouvala just called for a US war on medicine.
Well, it's happening.
I was going to say, they're already, isn't their health secretary already doing that?
Doing that, yeah. So I think there is two things on top of what Tamsin said, or they're linked. The one is, I think, this expansion of the war vocabulary and the war legal infrastructure, which has been going on for a long time, right? But we see it now happening through formal international law arguments, right? In many ways, also in Mexico, the so-called war on drugs was an extremely militarized enterprise that cost the lives of tens of thousands of people. And I think in a way we're seeing this now wash out into doctrinal international law arguments. So I think we see a sort of like even further and even open militarization and securitization of issues concerning addiction on the side of the US border and on the side of the Mexican border, poverty, basically, in inadequate state structures. So I think that's one ramification. And I think the other ramification of the unwilling or unable doctrine, and I've said that on a number of times before, is I think it brings back in as explicit way as it possibly could happen a hierarchy among states in international law. It tries to reintroduce to the doctrine of international law ideas of tiered sovereignty and tiered protection from aggression, right? That there are certain states that are willing and able, that have particular structures of governing or simply particular demographics, and they are willing and able, and therefore you cannot use quotation marks defensive force against them. And there are certain other states that they have different demographics and they have different governing structures, and supposedly defensive force, in reality, of course, aggressive force can be used against them, right? And it is extremely well documented that even when non-Western states invoke the unwilling or unable doctrine, it is always against the state that is markedly weaker than them, and often even, subordinated to them through some form of regional hegemonic arrangement. Right. So there is a power asymmetry, which, by the way, shoots through self-defense more broadly. It's not unique to unwilling or unable, but I would say unwilling or unable goes as far as we can with keeping nominally equal sovereignty under 2.1 of the UN Charter, while in reality introducing in the doctrine, not just in the application, but in the doctrine, legal inequality. I think that's kind of a problem.
Yeah, it's clearly functionally a return to gunboat diplomacy.
Yes, and yeah, I think, but also at the same time, I think, it's par for the course of how the US administration, especially this one, how frank they are with the idea that there are unequal sovereignties.
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Well,
But
and
that's been the US way well before this administration. That's been the US way for a very long time.
right, but there is also that system of sort of hegemon and periphery orders that structures international relations that may be legally structured. And I'm thinking here of Gary Simpson's early book, Great Powers and Outlaw States, where he talks about, the function of the Concert of Europe originally being to keep the West safe from democracy. Right, that absolute monarchy was obviously the way forward, and all these Republican democratic movements were terribly, terribly dangerous and needed to be kept in check. And that was the justification for the good states using force against the less good peripheral non-hegemonic states.
I'd also like to point out on that inequality, despite Article 2.1 of the UN Charter talking about sovereign equality, that's completely undermined by the existence of the P5 in the Security Council. Completely undermined. So even the structures of the UN Charter set up an unequal sovereignty framework.
Yep. No, law structures inequality. More news at 6. Right, now, I know we're going to lose Dina in a few minutes. So in wrapping up, we usually ask a non-international law question. And this season, we're asking, who is one of your favorite obscure or underrated characters in fiction, and why do they speak to you? Dina, I'm going to put you in the hot seat first because you have to go soon.
Yeah, I mean, it's not exactly underrated, but one of my hot takes about fiction is Daisy Buchanan did nothing wrong. You heard it here first. So, for those of you who might not know, Daisy Buchanan is the romantic interest in Great Gatsby, right? In The Great Gatsby. So, here's my defense of Daisy Buchanan, who's not exactly underrated, but I think she's unfairly maligned. She's a woman who is minding her own business. She's being harassed and stalked by Gatsby. And sure, her husband is a notorious white supremacist and eugenicist. I'm not saying he's great, but again, that's her husband. It's not her. I'm not saying she's like a moral character to look up to on how to live your life, but I think she was stalked and harassed by a random guy, and we don't give her enough credit for that.
Fair. Tamsin?
So I'm actually going to pick up on Primrose Tunstall from the Custard Protocol within Gail Carriger's Parasol verse. And I love Prim. Prim's a delightful character. She's proper, she's prim, she's organized, and all she wants to do is be normal. And the first 3 books of the Custard Protocol are her journey to accepting the fact that maybe she's not normal by Victorian English standards and she's in fact very, very gay. And then accepting that the grief that comes with that she won't have children of her own, and accepting all of the people who work on the airship that they travel around the world on are her family and her children under her care, and finding happiness in her own skin through that acceptance. and accepting that normal is bullshit is just it's a beautiful story, and I really like Prim.
Hooray! Well, that seems a happy note. All right. Well, I think that brings us to the conclusion of our discussion on taking the war on drugs down Mexico way. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, Dina. Thank you, Tams.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.